There is a day that never arrives with an announcement, a day that does not carry a date or leave a mark on the calendar, a day that does not demand attention and therefore rarely receives it, and yet something shifts on that day in a way that cannot be undone once noticed, because nothing breaks and nothing is taken openly, but something quietly changes its position inside you. And at first it feels like fatigue or distraction, or simply the weight of years accumulating without ceremony, and you tell yourself that it is normal to feel less sharp, less eager to insist, less inclined to correct or interrupt or press your point when the conversation moves on without you. And you accept this explanation because it is easier than tracing the subtle movement that has begun to occur, the movement where your opinion no longer lands with the same gravity it once did, where words that used to alter the course of a room now dissolve into the air without friction, and no one is rude about it. No one contradicts you outright. No one dismisses you openly. They simply continue as if your thought has already been accounted for or no longer requires response. And you notice it only afterward, in the silence that follows, in the slight hollow feeling that remains when the discussion ends, and you are unsure whether you were heard or merely tolerated, and this uncertainty becomes familiar, so familiar that it begins to feel like part of the background noise of life, like a faint hum you stop questioning, because it never stops, and you adapt by speaking less precisely, less insistently, by softening your statements before anyone else has the chance to do it for you, by adding small disclaimers you never needed before, phrases that lower the weight of what you are saying before it even leaves your mouth, and you tell yourself that this is wisdom, that this is maturity, that this is what it means to choose peace over friction. But somewhere beneath that explanation is a quieter truth, one that does not accuse or dramatize, only observes that something once central is now being gently placed to the side. And the most unsettling part is not that it is happening, but that it is happening without resistance, without a clear moment to object, without a scene that would justify anger or grief, because nothing has been taken by force. And that makes it difficult to name, difficult to defend against, difficult even to admit to yourself, since admitting it would require acknowledging that your place in the exchange of decisions, judgments, and interpretations has shifted without your consent, not because you suddenly became incapable, but because the world around you has quietly adjusted its posture toward you, and in doing so has invited you very politely to adjust your posture toward yourself, and you do, at first unconsciously, by hesitating where you once spoke freely, by pausing to see whether your input is actually needed before offering it, by measuring the room in a way you never had to before, and this measuring is exhausting in a way physical labor never was, because it requires constant self-monitoring, constant calibration, constant awareness of how much space you are allowed to take before it becomes uncomfortable for others. And this awareness creeps into ordinary moments, the kind that once passed without thought, choosing a restaurant, commenting on a plan, offering a suggestion about timing or direction or approach, and you notice that your voice enters these moments later now, after others have already framed the options, and when you do speak, it is often to affirm or adjust rather than to define. And again, nothing dramatic occurs. No one corrects you sharply. No one tells you that your input is unwelcome, but the structure of the interaction has changed, and you are now responding to a world that has already decided how much influence you are expected to have. And the danger of this change is not its cruelty, but its softness, because soft things do not trigger alarms, they do not provoke defenses, they invite accommodation, and you accommodate because you have lived long enough to understand the cost of constant friction, and because you tell yourself that insisting on being heard over small matters is unnecessary, even childish, and so you let them go. One by one, the small matters, the trivial preferences, the minor judgments, the subtle corrections, the instinct to speak before thinking about whether it will be welcomed, and each time you let one go, nothing terrible happens. The day continues. Relationships remain intact. Life moves forward, and this reinforces the idea that letting go is harmless, that it is even virtuous. And yet something accumulates in the background, something that feels like a gradual thinning of presence, as if you are still there but slightly out of focus, slightly less solid than before, and you begin to sense that your opinions are no longer expected to shape outcomes, only to decorate them, to add texture without altering direction. And this realization does not arrive as anger, but as a faint sadness that is easy to misinterpret. A sadness that feels more like nostalgia than loss, as if you are remembering a time when your words carried more weight, rather than noticing that they carry less now. And memory becomes a convenient explanation, because it allows you to locate the change in the past rather than in the present. To believe that what you are feeling is simply the echo of former relevance, rather than the quiet onset of current diminishment. And this belief allows the process to continue unchecked, because if the loss is already behind you, there is nothing to confront now, nothing to address, nothing to adjust, and so you move through conversations and decisions with a growing sense of detachment, not because you no longer care, but because caring feels increasingly unnecessary, and unnecessary feels increasingly invisible, and invisibility has a strange effect on the mind. It encourages withdrawal without requiring explanation. It invites you to shrink your engagement just enough that no one notices the change, including you. And the day your opinion quietly stops mattering is not the day someone tells you that you are wrong or outdated or incapable. It is the day you stop noticing whether your opinion matters at all, the day you begin to treat your own perspective as optional, as supplementary, as something that can be offered or withheld without consequence. And this is where awareness begins, not as a revelation but as a subtle unease, a sense that the world has become slightly misaligned, that you are standing in the same places and speaking the same language, but the responses you receive are calibrated differently now, and you cannot point to a single interaction as evidence because each one is reasonable on its own. Each one makes sense in context. Each one can be explained away as coincidence or courtesy or efficiency, and it is only when you look at the pattern, though you are not yet ready to call it that you feel the weight of something unspoken pressing against your chest, a recognition that does not yet have words, that something has shifted in the way decisions are made around you, that the center of gravity has moved slightly away from where you stand, and that this movement did not require your agreement, because it did not announce itself. And the quietness of this shift is what makes it so powerful, because it allows everyone involved, including you, to pretend that nothing has changed. And pretending is easy when the change is gradual, when it happens in increments too small to protest, too polite to resist, too ordinary to challenge. And so awareness begins not with clarity, but with discomfort, a discomfort that surfaces in moments of pause, in the space between speaking and being acknowledged, in the realization that your silence no longer feels like a choice, but like a default, and that realization lingers, unresolved, waiting for you to decide whether it is simply the natural progression of time, or the first signal of something being quietly taken, not from your body or your abilities, but from your position in the unseen hierarchy of whose thoughts shape the world, and whose thoughts are merely allowed to exist within it. At first you tell yourself that it is just convenience, that people are trying to make things easier, that they are anticipating needs, smoothing edges, removing friction before it appears. And this explanation feels reasonable because it matches the language that surrounds the change, language filled with concern and efficiency and care, language that sounds kind and therefore resists suspicion. And you accept it because questioning kindness feels ungrateful, because you have learned over time that resisting help can be interpreted as stubbornness, and you do not want to be seen that way. So when suggestions arrive framed as solutions, you nod. When plans are presented already formed, you adjust. When choices are narrowed for you in advance, you select from what is offered. And none of this feels like control in isolation. It feels like consideration. And yet something about the repetition begins to stand out, not sharply but persistently, like a pattern you notice only after it has repeated enough times to no longer be dismissed as coincidence, and the pattern is simple. Decisions that once began with a question now begin with an assumption. And you are included in the process, but not at the beginning. You are invited in after the frame has already been set, after the direction has already been chosen, and your role is to agree, to approve, to confirm, rather than to shape. And again, no one states this openly. No one announces that the structure has changed. It simply happens through tone and timing, through the way conversations are initiated and concluded, through the subtle shift from asking what you think to informing you what will happen. And this shift is almost imperceptible at first, because it mirrors how people treat one another when time feels limited. when efficiency is valued, when decisions are streamlined, and you tell yourself that this is not personal, that everyone is being handled this way, that this is just how things work now. And there is some truth in that, which makes it even harder to identify what feels wrong, because the pattern does not rely on malice or disrespect. It relies on normalization, and normalization is powerful, because it does not feel like pressure. It feels like the natural order asserting itself. And yet, as the pattern continues, you begin to recognize how often your preferences are interpreted rather than requested, how often your silence is taken as consent, how often concern becomes the justification for deciding on your behalf. And this is where recognition begins to sharpen, not into anger but into clarity, because you start to see how easily help slides into control when it is no longer paired with permission, and how often permission is assumed rather than given. And this assumption rests on an unspoken narrative, one that suggests that you are still capable but no longer authoritative, still present but no longer central, still included but no longer decisive. And this narrative is reinforced through small gestures: someone double-checking your plan, someone gently correcting your timeline, someone offering an alternative before you have finished explaining your own. And none of these gestures are hostile. They are wrapped in reassurance, in phrases meant to soften rather than confront. And that softness is precisely what allows the pattern to continue unchallenged, because challenging softness feels disproportionate, it feels dramatic, and you have spent enough of your life learning when not to make scenes, when to let things pass, when to preserve harmony. And so you let these moments pass one by one, even as they accumulate. And accumulation is the quiet mechanism through which autonomy erodes, not through force but through repetition, not through confrontation but through accommodation. And the more you accommodate, the more the pattern solidifies, because people respond to the path of least resistance. And when you do not resist being managed, management becomes the default. And soon you notice that your involvement in decisions is framed as reassurance rather than necessity. You are included so that you will feel comfortable, not because your input is required. And this distinction matters more than it first appears, because being included for comfort places you in a passive position, one where your role is emotional rather than directive. And this role comes with expectations that you will be agreeable, that you will not complicate things, that you will trust the judgment of those who are acting on your behalf. And trust becomes the moral framing that justifies the shift, because if you trust them, why would you need to decide? And if you question their decisions, why would you be trusted? And this logic is never spoken aloud, but it operates beneath the surface, guiding interactions, shaping dynamics, determining who speaks first and who responds. And recognition arrives when you realize that this logic is not neutral, that it favors those who act over those who consent, those who decide over those who approve, and that you are increasingly positioned in the latter category, not because you demanded it, but because you did not resist it. And resistance at this stage feels complicated, because it would require you to push back against people who believe they are helping, who would be genuinely surprised to hear that their concern feels limiting. And you imagine how that conversation would go, how you would have to explain something that has no single example, no clear incident, no dramatic turning point, only a gradual repositioning that feels undeniable to you but invisible to them. And this imagined difficulty becomes another reason to remain quiet, to continue adapting rather than confronting. And adaptation becomes second nature. You learn how to phrase your thoughts so they fit within existing plans, how to offer suggestions that do not disrupt momentum, how to withdraw gracefully when it becomes clear that a decision has already been made, and each of these adjustments feels reasonable in the moment. But together, they form a pattern of self-limitation, a pattern that is reinforced every time your compliance is rewarded with smoothness, with approval, with the absence of conflict. And this reward system trains you to value ease over influence, peace over presence. And you begin to recognize that the most effective form of control is not the one that restricts options openly, but the one that reshapes your relationship to choice itself, making you less inclined to assert it, less invested in exercising it, less certain that it is worth the effort. And this is when recognition deepens into something more sobering, the realization that autonomy does not disappear because someone takes it, but because it becomes inconvenient to use. And when autonomy is inconvenient, it is often framed as unnecessary, and when it is unnecessary, it is slowly forgotten. And you see how this forgetting is supported by language, by routines, by expectations that are never questioned, and you begin to notice how often decisions are made in the name of what is best for you without asking what you want, how often your past preferences are used to justify present choices without checking whether they still apply, how often efficiency is prioritized over dialogue, and you understand that none of this requires ill intent. It only requires a shift in perception, a shift that places you just far enough from the center that your voice is no longer essential, and this recognition does not arrive as outrage, because outrage would imply a clear injustice, and this feels more ambiguous than that, more diffuse, more difficult to point at, but it does arrive as a quiet tightening inside you, a sense that something important is being redefined without your participation, and that the redefinition is happening so gently that it almost feels natural. And this is what makes it dangerous, because what feels natural is rarely questioned, and what is not questioned becomes permanent. And you begin to see that the danger is not that others are deciding for you, but that you are slowly accepting a role where being decided for feels appropriate, and recognition at this stage is not about assigning blame. It is about seeing the structure clearly enough to understand how it operates, how concern becomes permission, how help becomes authority, how inclusion becomes management, and how all of this can happen without a single moment that feels like loss, even as something essential is being quietly repositioned. Something that once anchored you in the world as a participant rather than a dependent. And this recognition lingers, unresolved, because seeing the pattern does not yet tell you what to do about it. It only tells you that what you have been experiencing is not random, not imaginary, not merely the result of aging bodies or changing times, but a coherent shift in how decision-making flows around you. And that coherence is both clarifying and unsettling, because it suggests that what has been lost was not taken accidentally, but yielded gradually through a series of reasonable choices that all made sense on their own, and now sit together as a pattern you can no longer ignore, even if you are not yet ready to challenge it. There is a point where recognition turns into weight, where seeing the pattern is no longer an abstract awareness, but something that presses down on the chest with a steady, unrelenting presence, because once you see it, you cannot unsee it, and the moments that once passed unnoticed now land with a different force, each one carrying a quiet confirmation of what you already know. And this is where loss begins to register, not as a single event, but as a cumulative sensation, the feeling of being repositioned without being consulted, of having your role adjusted while you were still standing in it. And this repositioning does not announce itself with exclusion. It announces itself with supervision, with oversight, with an increased attention to how you do things, when you do them, whether you should still be doing them at all, and at first this attention feels flattering, even reassuring, because attention is often mistaken for care, and care is something you have learned to value, especially as the years accumulate and the world becomes more uncertain. But over time, the quality of the attention changes, and you begin to feel that it is no longer directed at supporting your agency, but at managing your presence, at ensuring that your actions remain within acceptable bounds. And this management is subtle, rarely explicit, often framed as assistance, and yet it carries an emotional weight that is difficult to articulate, because it alters how you are seen and therefore how you are treated. And being treated differently changes how you experience yourself, even when you resist that change internally, because the external world provides constant feedback, and when that feedback shifts, it leaves an imprint, and the imprint is not about competence, but about authority. The authority to decide, to judge, to choose without justification. And you feel this loss most acutely in conversation, in the way people speak to you now, slightly slower, slightly more explanatory, slightly more directive, as if clarity must be provided in advance to prevent misunderstanding. And you notice that statements are phrased as instructions rather than exchanges, that suggestions come with an implied expectation of compliance, and when you do offer a differing view, it is met with reassurance rather than engagement, a reassurance that implies that your concern has been noted but does not need to alter the course of action. And this is a specific kind of dismissal, one that does not argue with you because it does not see you as an equal participant in the decision. And this realization stings in a way that is difficult to explain, because it is not about ego or pride. It is about being recognized as someone whose judgment still matters, whose perspective still carries weight beyond emotional comfort. And the loss of this recognition creates a quiet grief, one that does not demand expression but lingers in the background of daily interactions, coloring them with a sense of distance you did not feel before. And this distance is not physical, it is relational. It is the space between being consulted and being informed, between being asked and being told, and you find yourself increasingly on the receiving end of information rather than at the center of deliberation. And this shift affects not only how others treat you, but how you move through the world. Because when you are no longer positioned as a decision maker, your engagement naturally changes. You become more cautious, more reserved, less inclined to invest energy in shaping outcomes you suspect are already decided. And this reservation can be mistaken for passivity, which then reinforces the very perception that justified your repositioning in the first place, creating a self-sustaining cycle where reduced engagement is read as reduced capacity, and reduced capacity invites further management. And each turn of this cycle deepens the loss, not because you are incapable of breaking it, but because breaking it would require a level of confrontation that feels increasingly out of character for the role you are now expected to occupy. And this expectation is communicated through subtle cues, through body language, through tone, through the way people glance at one another before responding to you as if checking alignment, as if confirming that they are on the same page about how much weight to give your input. And noticing these cues is painful, not because they are overtly disrespectful, but because they reveal an unspoken consensus that you were not part of forming, and being excluded from consensus is one of the most isolating experiences there is, because it removes you from the collective sense-making that defines shared reality. And without shared reality, your voice floats unanchored, easier to ignore, easier to redirect, easier to absorb without consequence. And you begin to feel managed rather than engaged, handled rather than consulted. And this feeling extends beyond specific interactions into a broader sense of being repositioned within the social landscape, as if your role has shifted from participant to responsibility, from agent to object of concern. And this shift carries emotional consequences that are rarely acknowledged, because the narrative surrounding aging emphasizes safety, comfort, and support, but rarely speaks about the cost of being treated as someone whose primary function is to be cared for rather than to contribute. And that cost is paid internally, through a gradual erosion of self-trust, through the quiet questioning of whether your instincts are still reliable, through the temptation to defer even when you do not fully agree, simply to avoid the discomfort of being overruled or reassured, and this temptation grows stronger. The more often your resistance is met with patience rather than debate, because patience, in this context, carries the implication that your objection is understandable but ultimately unnecessary. And being treated as unnecessary is a profound form of loss, because it strips meaning from effort. And when effort feels meaningless, withdrawal feels rational, and you withdraw in small ways by letting others speak first, by allowing plans to solidify before offering input, by framing your opinions as tentative suggestions rather than firm positions. And each of these withdrawals feels minor, but together they reshape your identity, moving you further away from the person who once trusted their own judgment without hesitation. And this reshaping does not feel like surrender at first. It feels like adaptation, like maturity, like choosing your battles. And you have spent enough of your life learning to choose wisely, to conserve energy, to prioritize what truly matters, that this adaptation feels familiar, even responsible. And yet the cumulative effect is a narrowing of influence, a shrinking of presence, a quiet loss of standing that is difficult to mourn because it does not come with clear markers. There is no ceremony for being repositioned, no acknowledgement that something has been taken, no language to validate the grief, and without validation, grief turns inward, becoming a private ache that you carry alone. And this ache surfaces in moments of unexpected intensity, when you realize that decisions are being made about your life, with minimal input from you, when you hear plans discussed as if they are already settled, when you are thanked for your understanding instead of asked for your opinion. And gratitude in these moments feels heavy because it assumes agreement where there may be none, and expressing disagreement feels increasingly difficult, because it would disrupt the narrative of smooth cooperation that has been built around you, and disrupting that narrative would cast you as difficult, ungrateful, resistant, and these labels carry social costs that you instinctively avoid, not because you fear conflict, but because you recognize how quickly resistance can be reinterpreted as evidence of decline. And this reinterpretation is one of the most painful aspects of the loss, because it turns assertion into pathology, autonomy into stubbornness, disagreement into risk, and knowing this makes you cautious in a way that feels foreign. Because caution was once a strategic choice, not a protective reflex. And now it governs interactions that once felt effortless, and this change creates a sense of being out of sync with yourself, of acting in ways that do not fully align with your internal reality. And living with that misalignment is draining, because it requires constant self-editing, constant awareness of how your actions will be interpreted, constant negotiation between what you want to say and what feels safe to say. And this negotiation becomes part of your daily experience, shaping not only external interactions, but internal dialogue, as you begin to question your own impulses before anyone else has the chance to do so. And this self-questioning is perhaps the deepest loss of all, because it represents a shift from trusting your inner authority to preemptively doubting it. And this doubt does not arrive as insecurity, but as caution, as reasonableness, as restraint. And these qualities are praised, encouraged, rewarded, which makes it even harder to see how they are being used to contain you. And the containment is gentle. It does not feel like a cage. It feels like guidance, like boundaries set for your own good. And this framing makes resistance feel selfish, because who would object to what is done for their benefit? And yet beneath the framing is a reality that cannot be ignored once felt. The reality that you are being slowly moved into a position where your primary value is compliance, where your dignity is measured by how smoothly you accept decisions made by others, where your autonomy is respected only insofar as it does not complicate management, and recognizing this reality brings with it a sense of mourning, not for lost youth or strength, but for lost standing, for the quiet demotion from full participant to managed presence. And this mourning does not seek expression because it lacks a socially acceptable form. It does not fit into narratives of successful aging or graceful acceptance, and so it remains internal, a silent acknowledgement that something essential has been taken not through force, but through process, not through malice, but through structure. And this acknowledgement sits with you, heavy but contained, as you move through days that look outwardly unchanged, carrying an awareness that alters how you see every interaction, every decision, every moment where your voice enters a space already shaped without it. And this is the emotional weight of loss, not loud or dramatic but persistent, shaping your experience from the inside, reminding you that what has been lost is not simply the right to decide, but the recognition that your decisions matter, and that recognition, once withdrawn, leaves a hollow space that no amount of care or reassurance can fill. Because it is not comfort that is missing, it is authority, and authority, once quietly removed, leaves behind a silence that is difficult to endure precisely because it is so polite. There comes a moment when the weight stops pressing and instead settles, when the ache no longer surprises you, and instead clarifies something that had been obscured by reaction. And this is not because the loss has been resolved or reversed, but because you have finally stopped arguing with what is happening long enough to see it cleanly, without distortion, without resentment, without the need to defend or justify your feelings. And in that stillness, a different understanding begins to take shape, one that does not depend on reclaiming anything externally, because you start to see that what has been eroding is not the totality of your autonomy, but a particular expression of it, one that relied on recognition, on participation, on visible authority within shared structures. And those structures can shift, can close ranks, can redefine roles without ever asking your permission, and no amount of explanation or insistence will fully restore what they have already reorganized. And this realization, rather than defeating you, brings an unexpected calm, because it removes the false hope that the answer lies in correcting others, in demanding to be seen the way you once were. enforcing acknowledgement from a system that has already adjusted its expectations, and clarity begins when you stop seeking your authority in places that no longer grant it. When you recognize that influence and autonomy are not identical, that one can diminish while the other remains intact, and that the confusion you have been carrying comes from treating them as the same thing, because influence depends on permission, on access, on being invited into the process, while autonomy exists independently of invitation. And this distinction changes how you interpret what has happened, because it allows you to see that while your influence has been narrowed, your capacity to choose has not been removed unless you allow it to be. And this does not mean pretending that the external loss is insignificant. It means understanding its limits, understanding where its reach ends and where your internal position begins. And this understanding does not arrive as defiance, it arrives as orientation, a quiet realignment of where you stand in relation to the world, and you begin to notice that many of the moments that felt like loss were moments where you deferred internally before any external decision was finalized. Moments where you surrendered choice, not because it was taken, but because asserting it felt uncomfortable, disruptive, or unnecessary. And seeing this does not bring shame, it brings precision, because precision replaces helplessness with agency, and agency, even when exercised quietly, changes how you experience yourself. And you begin to recognize that autonomy is not located in winning arguments or directing outcomes, but in maintaining authorship over your own responses, judgments, and consent. And consent is where clarity sharpens, because consent is often assumed rather than given, and reclaiming it does not require confrontation. It requires awareness, the awareness to notice when agreement is being presumed, when silence is being interpreted, when compliance is being expected, and to decide internally and deliberately whether you are consenting or merely accommodating. And this decision can remain private. It does not need to be announced, because its power lies in the fact that you are no longer moving automatically, no longer surrendering choice by default. And this internal shift alters your posture in subtle ways. You begin to pause before agreeing, not to resist but to check in with yourself. You begin to distinguish between what is acceptable and what is aligned, between what is easy and what is true. And this distinction restores a sense of internal order that had been disrupted by constant adaptation. And as this order returns, you notice that the need to be consulted externally diminishes slightly, not because it no longer matters, but because your sense of self is no longer dependent on it. And dependence is what made the loss feel so destabilizing, because when your dignity is tied to external recognition, any withdrawal of that recognition feels existential. And clarity comes from severing that tie without severing connection to others, from allowing relationships to exist without requiring them to validate your authority. And this does not mean becoming passive or withdrawn. It means becoming selective, intentional, grounded. And you begin to see that there are decisions you truly do not need to influence, that expending energy on them was once a habit rather than a necessity, and releasing that habit frees attention for choices that remain entirely yours, choices that cannot be managed or supervised or reframed by others unless you permit it. And these choices often appear small on the surface, but they carry disproportionate weight because they shape how you inhabit your days, how you think, how you interpret events, how you allow yourself to feel. And reclaiming authority here has a stabilizing effect, because it restores continuity between your internal values and your external actions. And this continuity had been strained by constant accommodation, and as it returns, the sense of being out of sync with yourself begins to fade, replaced by a quieter confidence that does not need to assert itself, because it is not trying to prove anything. It is simply present, and this presence changes how you perceive interactions that once felt diminishing. You begin to see that being informed, rather than consulted, does not automatically require submission, that you can acknowledge information without internalizing its authority, that you can allow plans to proceed without relinquishing your right to interpret them on your own terms. And this interpretation is where autonomy resides, because no one can decide for you what something means unless you accept their framing. And framing is one of the most overlooked sites of control because it operates beneath content, shaping how situations are understood before choices are even considered. And clarity involves reclaiming this interpretive authority, deciding for yourself whether concern is actually care, whether efficiency is actually respect, whether inclusion is actually participation, and making these determinations internally without the need to persuade others. And this internal discernment acts as a filter preventing automatic compliance, restoring a sense of choice even within constrained circumstances. And this does not eliminate the reality of external limits. It simply prevents them from defining you entirely, and in doing so it restores dignity, not as a status granted by others, but as a posture you inhabit. And this posture is calm, unreactive, unannounced, and because it does not demand recognition, it cannot be withdrawn. And this is the core of the clarity that emerges, the understanding that what cannot be taken is what you no longer outsource, that autonomy survives not in the absence of constraint, but in the refusal to surrender internal authority to structures that no longer center you. And this refusal does not need to be loud, because loudness invites negotiation, invites pushback, invites reinterpretation, and what you are reclaiming does not require any of that. It requires only that you remain internally aligned, that you notice when choice is present even if limited, that you recognize when agreement is optional even if expected, and that you accept the discomfort that sometimes accompanies quiet non-compliance, not as a problem to be solved, but as a sign that you are no longer moving purely on habit. And this acceptance stabilizes you, because it replaces the earlier confusion with a grounded sense of where autonomy truly lives, not in being asked, not in being deferred to, not in being included at the start of every conversation, but in maintaining authorship over your own consent, interpretation, and inner stance. And this clarity does not erase the loss you have felt, but it contextualizes it, placing it within a larger understanding of selfhood that is less vulnerable to external rearrangement. And in this context, the world's quiet decisions no longer feel like total erasure. They feel like limitations to be navigated rather than verdicts to be internalized. And this shift, subtle and internal, marks the transition from loss to clarity, not as resolution but as orientation, a steadying of the self that prepares the ground for something quieter, something more durable, something that does not require permission to exist. What follows is not a reversal and not a reclamation in any visible sense, because nothing returns to how it was, and no one suddenly begins asking again in the way they once did. And this absence of external change is precisely what allows a different posture to take root, one that does not rely on restoration or recognition, one that exists entirely without announcement, because quiet autonomy does not correct the world. It corrects alignment within yourself, and that alignment expresses itself not through resistance but through ownership, a calm internal ownership that does not need to be validated to be real. And you feel this first in the way you no longer rush to fill silence, no longer hurry to signal agreement, no longer preemptively soften your position to make it easier for others to accept. And this does not come from bitterness or withdrawal. It comes from steadiness, from a settled understanding that your thoughts do not need immediate translation into influence to be legitimate. And with that understanding, your internal tempo slows, not out of fatigue but out of precision, and you become more deliberate about what you engage with, not because you are conserving energy in a defensive way, but because you are no longer willing to disperse attention where it will be absorbed without consequence. And this selectivity changes how you move through conversations and decisions. You listen more fully, but you also decide more privately, allowing yourself to form conclusions without needing to test them immediately against the reactions of others. And this privacy becomes a form of protection, not secrecy, but containment, the containment of judgment until it is truly needed, and this containment restores a sense of authorship that had been diluted by constant accommodation, because you are no longer orienting your thoughts toward acceptance before they have even settled within you. And this shift is subtle enough that no one remarks on it, which is exactly how it gains strength, because it does not provoke recalibration from others. It does not invite new management or correction. It simply exists as a change in your internal posture. And posture matters more than position, because posture determines how you experience whatever position you are placed in. And as your posture steadies, you notice that being informed rather than consulted no longer feels inherently diminishing, because you are no longer confusing information with instruction. And this distinction restores choice even when options are limited, Because you understand that acknowledging a plan does not require internal surrender, and internal surrender is the only place where autonomy can truly be lost. And this understanding frees you from the compulsion to assert yourself prematurely, to correct every assumption, to re-establish authority in spaces that no longer operate on that currency. And instead you begin to exercise autonomy where it cannot be negotiated away, in your interpretation, in your consent, in your boundaries. And boundaries here are not spoken rules. They are internal limits on what you will accept as given, what you will internalize as truth, what you will allow to define you, and these limits shape your experience quietly, without confrontation, without explanation. And this quietness is not avoidance, it is strategy, because loud autonomy invites contest, while quiet autonomy bypasses it. And bypassing is often more effective than opposing, because it does not trigger defense, it does not demand justification. It simply redirects energy back to where it belongs. And you feel this redirection in the way you no longer argue internally with decisions that have already been made, no longer rehearse explanations you will never be asked to give, no longer measure your worth by how much influence you had in an outcome. And this release creates space, and in that space something steadier emerges, a sense of self that is not dependent on participation in every process to feel intact. And this sense of self is not diminished by being managed externally, because it is no longer seeking validation from systems that do not reflect its values. And this internal independence allows you to remain connected without being absorbed, present without being positioned, engaged without being controlled. And this balance is delicate but durable, because it is maintained internally rather than enforced externally. And as it stabilizes, you notice that your reactions soften, not because you care less, but because you are no longer fighting a battle that cannot be won on its own terms. And this softness is not resignation, it is clarity in action. The clarity to see when to speak and when to remain silent, when to engage and when to observe, when to comply and when to withhold internal agreement. And withholding internal agreement is often the most powerful form of autonomy available, because it preserves the integrity of your judgment even when circumstances require cooperation. And this preservation protects dignity in a way that no amount of external control can undermine, because dignity here is not granted by being deferred to, it is maintained by refusing to internalize narratives that reposition you as lesser. And this refusal does not require denial. It requires discernment, the discernment to separate practical limitation from personal diminishment, to accept constraints without absorbing their implications about your worth. And this discernment becomes a quiet companion, guiding how you interpret interactions, how you respond to concern, how you receive assistance, and you begin to notice that help no longer feels threatening when it is no longer confused with authority, because you are no longer surrendering authorship when you accept it. And authorship is the core of quiet autonomy, the authorship of your own meaning, your own priorities, your own sense of self, and this authorship cannot be revoked unless you relinquish it, and you no longer do, not out of defiance, but out of clarity. And clarity has a calming effect because it reduces internal conflict, reduces the friction between who you are and how you are treated, by removing the expectation that the two must align perfectly. And this removal is liberating because it allows you to inhabit your life without constant correction, without the need to be fully seen to feel whole. And this wholeness expresses itself not through assertion but through presence, a steady presence that does not seek to dominate or withdraw. That simply remains intact, regardless of how others orient themselves. And this presence alters the tone of your engagement subtly. People may notice that you are calmer, less reactive, less eager to justify yourself, but they do not necessarily understand why, and you do not explain because explanation would imply a need for validation, and you no longer need that. And in this way, autonomy returns not as a right reclaimed, but as a state inhabited, a state that does not announce itself or demand recognition because it is not trying to re-enter a hierarchy. It has stepped outside the need for one, and this stepping outside is not isolation. It is independence of meaning, the independence to decide what matters to you regardless of how much weight others give it. And this independence allows you to move through a world that means well without being shaped by its assumptions, to accept care without surrendering dignity, to cooperate without dissolving agency. And this is the quiet autonomy that remains when opinions are no longer sought. But self-respect is no longer negotiable, a form of ownership that does not seek to be restored to its former place, because it has found a different foundation, one that cannot be quietly taken, because it is no longer quietly given away.